Hi, Isla. I think we're good to go.
Fantastic. Welcome everyone to the first session of the 2022 ASPG conference. Before commencing, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, wherever we are meeting, and pay respect to their elders past and present. I would also like to offer huge congratulations to the Victorian Parliament and the Victorian chapter of the ASPG for pulling together such an interesting and worthwhile conference, notwithstanding formidable challenges. I'm the moderator for this session, and my name is Isla MacPhail. I'm the Western Australian Legislative Assembly's Sergeant-at-Arms and Principal Research Officer to the Procedure and Privileges Committee. In relation to the ASPG, I'm the WA Chapter Secretary-Treasurer and the National Vice President. The title of Session 1 is Impacts of COVID-19, and it seems totally fitting that both presenters are from Victoria, given Melbourne, over the course of 6 lockdowns, was locked down longer than any other city in the world. Will Australians ever forget those daily morning press conferences in 2020 with Premier Daniel Andrews and his North Face jacket? Our first presenter is Dr. Vaughn Koops, who will speak to the topic, COVID procedural variants, experiences of the Victorian Legislative Assembly. By way of background, Vaughn is Assistant Clerk Committees with the Victorian Legislative Assembly. Vaughn joined the Parliament of Victoria as a research officer in 2003, and from 2005 worked as Executive Officer to 5 joint committees prior to his appointment as Assistant Clerk Committees in 2014. Vaughn was Assistant Clerk Procedure and Sergeant-at-Arms from July 2016 to June 2020, and returned to the role of Assistant Clerk Committees in July 2020. Vaughn holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts with First Class Honours from Auckland University and has a PhD from Melbourne University. Vaughn has been the Treasurer of the Victorian chapter of the ASPG since 2015. Our second presenter is Professor Ken Coghill, who will speak to the topic, Parliaments, the Pandemic and Accountability. Professor Coghill is an adjunct professor at Swinburne University of Technology and a former member and speaker of the Victorian Legislative Assembly. After retiring from Parliament in 1995, Ken completed a PhD at Melbourne University and is currently a member of the International Political Science Association Research Committee of Legislative Specialists, co-chair of the Australian Government's Open Government Forum, a member of the Editorial Advisory Board for the Journal of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, and a member of the Victorian ASPG Chapter Executive. Both presenters will speak for 20 minutes. At the conclusion of their presentation, there will be approximately 20 minutes of Q&A. I would now like to call on Dr. Vaughn Koops.
Thank you, Isla. I'll attempt to share my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can sort of see a slideshow going on there. Thank you very much for welcoming me here, and thank you, Isla, for that introduction. I am just going to give a fairly brief overview of what's happened, some of the effects and things that happened with COVID for the Parliament of Victoria, the Legislative Assembly in Victoria. I think Ken is about to provide an overview about the effects and responses to COVID in parliaments nationally and beyond. So in anticipation of that, I'm really just going to provide a snapshot of what happened in a particular jurisdiction. The theme of this conference has been mentioned before. It's about transparency, checks and balances. I'm going to focus more on the balancing part in this little presentation, really talking about how the need for the Parliament to ensure accountable government balanced up with the need of the government and the executive to respond to COVID-19 through state of emergency powers and to try and ensure the well-being of the population. And in doing so, I'll step through some of the more significant changes that occurred in Legislative Assembly practices and procedures. Okay, so on Monday, 16th of February 2020, a state of emergency was declared in Victoria. Initially, it just applied to large gatherings of 500 or more people and led to things like the dramatic cancelling of the Grand Prix that was due to start that morning, actually. In response, the presiding officers in the Victorian Parliament decided to close the precinct to the public and only allowed pass holders into the building. The parliamentary response to COVID wasn't entirely executive driven from day one. The next day after the state of emergency was declared was actually scheduled as a sitting day. So Tuesday, the 17th of February, 2020, the government came to the House and sought to change sitting arrangements by leave. They were asking the House to agree to have shorter sitting days and to leave out some kinds of debate in order to get through the sitting more quickly. Leave was refused. I'll talk a little bit more about what leave is, and for people who aren't totally enveloped in the parliamentary way of thinking about things. Leave was refused, so the government couldn't move those changes and the sitting day went ahead as normal. The next day, however, the government did get to move a motion to try and stop the debates, or rather to make the sitting end a little bit earlier and to also leave out some of the kinds of debates from the sitting day procedures. After some consultation with the opposition and the crossbench, and I think also probably some backbenchers from the government, from the Labor Party itself, that motion was amended during the day to allow the incorporation of statements and adjournment matters. So even though those things weren't necessarily spoken in the House, they could be put into Hansard and still published. So that sitting week went ahead with those changes, not too dramatically different at that stage. And at the end of the week, the House adjourned until a day and an hour to be fixed by the Speaker. So usually when the House adjourns, they have a sitting of the House motion when they say, well, okay, we're going to come back. In this case, it was originally meant to be on the 5th of May, 2020 for Budget Day. But in this case, the House agreed that the Speaker would be able to tell the House or to inform members when they should return for the next sitting. So that sort of set the scene for 2020. And then as 2020 developed and COVID, of course, became more entrenched and more significant in the lives of all Victorians in particular, some fairly consistent responses occurred throughout the year. There were motions in the House to reduce the number of members in the chamber. Initially on the 23rd of April, which was when the House actually did meet. So it actually ended up meeting a couple of weeks earlier than it was originally meant to. The House had 26 members in it with the Speaker and the Chair and a proportional allocation within that 26. So usually the House is 88 members or 87 on the floor and the Speaker. And X amount are members of the government and X amount are members of the Liberals and the Nationals. So in maintaining that proportionality, they did that through their reduced numbers as well. They relaxed some rules about members being able to speak anywhere in the chamber, so they weren't restricted to their allocated seats. And the incorporation of member statements, constituency questions and adjournment matters and statements of committee reports was pretty much continued through most of 2020. There were also some changes in the rules that the House agreed to allow things to happen outside sitting days that were normally restricted to sitting days. So the clerk could accept and publish certain documents, things like annual reports, committee reports, things of that nature. The Speaker was able to accept resignations and appointments to committees, which also would normally only happen through the House, and to allow extended or amended reporting dates for committee inquiries. Also, some unusual things that happened when the House did meet. So, for example, on the 23rd of April 2020, the House met and actually considered the budget early. So there was not only a COVID-19 omnibus bill, which had been put together fairly quickly and was agreed to by both houses eventually on that day of 23rd of April. There are also an appropriation bill, a parliamentary appropriation bill, and a state tax bill. And unusually those were introduced and just covered for half the financial year, so from 1 July through to 31st of December, rather than a full financial year. And the House also agreed to consider those bills in concurrent debate. So all three bills were debated at the same time, rather than considered separately during the sitting of the House. As 2020 progressed, at least, sitting arrangements changed from week to week as the requirements associated with the state of emergency changed, but also as the LA refined how it did things and found better ways, or at least more smoother ways to get things done as it went about its business. And each week, as the sitting of the House motion was put, so that when they agreed to come back the next time, there was always a provision that the Speaker could delay the next sitting date based on health advice and in consultation with the Leader of the House and the Manager of Opposition Business, and the opinion of third parties as well. So there's always like a stopgap position put in place throughout 2020 and most of 2021 as well, that if the health advice advised against the House meeting, the Speaker could cancel that sitting or change the date that it would next meet. Through 2020 and 21, it became fairly routine for the Leader of the House to move a motion at the start of each sitting week, adjusting the sitting arrangements, quite often, as I said, with small variations as they went through each time, depending on the health advice and the restrictions, and the negotiations with the other parties. Just by way of example, even just the number of members who are permitted on the floor of the chamber. In June 2020, 28 members were allowed on the floor of the chamber. In September, 20 members. In October onwards to the end of the year, 24 members were allowed in the chamber. In February 2021, we had 56 members. Then the next sitting week, 24 members. Then next week, 56. And this is all sort of following the waves of all our various lockdowns and other restrictions. And then from June 2021, pretty much had 29 members in the chamber, all socially distanced, which actually meant that we were using more parts of the chamber, like the lower galleries and the Legislative Assembly, we considered part of the chamber for the purposes of debates. Other sitting arrangements that were introduced in 2021 or continued from 2020 were allowing remote participation. So members could participate by a Zoom link, as it turned out, and a screen in the chamber. Changing the order of business and suspending the sitting from time to time to allow cleaning and having, sanitation done throughout the chamber from time to time. Members continuing to incorporate their contributions into Hansard bills, member statements, committee reports, constituency questions, and adjournment matters. The ability for members also to register their opinion on a division by submitting what their position is in writing to the clerk within a certain time frame after a division occurred. So not all members could vote when there's a matter before the House. So if a division did occur, members who weren't able to be in the chamber at the time were allowed to have their views recorded, at least officially. And also there were masks, face masks, throughout the 2 years, excluding, and the only time a member could remove their mask was when they had the call to speak. So that's a bit of an overview of some of the main things that happened 2020 to 21. So I guess the question is, how well did these arrangements balance accountability functions of the House with the logistical response to COVID-19? In some ways, by the standards of the Victorian Legislative Assembly at least, not too much was lost in the process. Every time the House sat, there was still a question time. So that was retained regardless of the other arrangements. There was still a way through the incorporation of speeches and debates on bills and things. There's still a way for members to put their views on record and to have their views protected by parliamentary privilege by means of Hansard in that case. There was still the same mechanisms for responses to members' adjournment matters and constituency questions to be responded to, and questions on notice for that matter. Formal business still occurred on sitting days. So although some reports were tabled out of sitting, there was still the ability for other reports or reports to be tabled by leave by ministers, for petitions to be tabled, and for messages to be received from the council or the governor or whoever it might be who was sending, who the House needed to acknowledge a message from. And also, and as I mentioned, there are also the alternative arrangements for reports to be tabled out of sitting and committees to continue operating. These measures weren't always satisfactory to all members, though, however, even for remote participation, for example, although there was an opportunity there for members to ask questions and contribute to debate, they weren't able to raise points of order, to vote, or to be counted as for a quorum when they're making their contribution. There's also, even in fact, in practice, only the independents in the Legislative Assembly made use of remote participation. But even then, some of those independents said, well, you know, this is okay, but actually my constituents voted or selected me as the representative so that I could be in the House and place a vote on record, even if that vote was overwhelmed by the choices of other members. There's still in principle, there's still a responsibility of the House to consider the vote and the opinions of its members and to formally recognise those in its proceedings. And also, I guess, around remote participation, it also raised the interesting issue of what present meant. In Victoria, the Constitution Act requires members to be present for a quorum and present for divisions and things like that. Although some legal advice was obtained by the presiding officers and eventually released by the President of the Legislative Council on what present mean, and in which the legal advice suggested that actually the everyday understanding of present should be acceptable, and that therefore someone participating by remote participation should be counted as present for the purposes of a meeting or a vote or a quorum. The government actually decided to take a fairly conservative line on that and interpret present literally as meaning physically present in the building. That's or during the debate, which is how present has been interpreted for other things like parliamentary committees. And I guess in the context of things, with significant legislation going through the houses around, you know, the pandemic, and quite significant community opposition in some sectors to that legislation, the government wasn't willing to take the risk that, say, a court could strike down some legislation because not sufficient people were physically present if they didn't accept the legal advice, you know, the advice that the House had received about what present might mean. So that was a kind of an interesting thing that came up during COVID as well. Even in incorporation of contributions, it was a pragmatic solution to what was going on when members couldn't actually physically be at Parliament, and also allowed them, as I said, to have privilege applied to their contributions. But it also, in the process, you miss out on one of the founding principles of the Parliament, is that it's a place where debate occurs, where people talk to one another and hopefully even convince one another of their opinions and change minds, essentially. And part of this is reflected in parliamentary traditions about members not reading speeches. So, so if a member's reading from a document, you can call another member could call a point of order and claim that they're reading that document and please make it available to the House. So usually there's an expectation that members don't come with pre-prepared speeches, because that implies that they're not open to changing their mind during the course of debate. Now, of course, incorporating contributions entrenches that. You know, if you're putting in a speech, there's no way you're going to change your mind about the content of it by reading other people's speeches or having heard the debates going on. So, so that was sort of, from a clerk's perspective, that's an important aspect of debates that was kind of lost through the incorporation of documents In practice, however, if you want to also be a pragmatist, usually when the parties come to the parliament, the government already has a position on a particular bill or a motion, even to the point of providing its members with speaking notes. They pretty much make contributions to the House that echo, in some cases, not in every case, of course, but echo their colleagues' contributions. And even the opposition, it's very rare for a member to cross the floor. In fact, the only time we've had that has actually been during COVID, when one member from the Liberal Party crossed the floor to vote against the introduction of mandatory vaccinations for the House. And he is the only one who crossed the floor, so his vote was merely registered anyway. So in fact, as it turns out, usually even hearing the other debates contributions, members' positions are fairly entrenched already. I'm getting towards winding up now, but it was interesting that pretty much throughout the entire 2020 and 2021, all of the special arrangements that were introduced for each parliamentary sitting in the Legislative Assembly were introduced by leave. And like I said before, so that meant that the government would first negotiate with the manager of opposition business and the crossbench, and so the Liberals, the Nationals, and the Greens and the Independents, and they'd pretty much come up with a form of sitting arrangements that everyone agreed to before they came along to the first day of the sitting. And therefore they could move by leave that be agreed to, which basically meant that usually you can't just introduce a motion, you'd have to announce that you're going to move the motion tomorrow, and the earliest you could get onto it was tomorrow. So by introducing it by leave, they actually allowed every member in the House, any member in the House, the ability to refuse leave and therefore not have that motion go ahead straight away. So, and I guess from our perspective as clerks, sometimes we thought, well, maybe the government would just introduce these arrangements for a few months, and so that they wouldn't have to take the risk of having leave refused every time the House sat. But as it turned out, yes, they did just take it in and move motions by leave. So that was a positive aspect, I think, and still retained some power in the House, in every member of the House, to refuse those arrangements to go ahead from week to week. But what now? Well, there's been we're not out of COVID, but now that restrictions have been eased quite a lot compared to what they have been over the last few years, there's pretty much been a desire of members to get back to business as usual. So we no longer have remote participation, we no longer have incorporation of debates, no delegation of tabling, no register of opinions. Members have been quite keen to get back into the chamber and get back to debating in person again and doing what they normally do. I guess perhaps at this point, one of the more significant, but still more significant for clerks and people in our tours team who carry documents around. We have a lot less documents in the House. We tend to do electronic distribution now, which is great for the environment and great for us, and great for information too. But really not too many other substantial changes have endured. So that is my contribution for now.
Thank you, Vaughn. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Thank you very much for that presentation. I look forward to the Q&A. But right now, I'd like to call on Professor Ken Coghill to make his contribution on Parliament's The Pandemic and Accountability.
Look, thank you very much for that introduction, Isla, and thank you very much, Vaughn, for your contribution, which covered quite a few points which are not addressed by the research that I've been doing, and I'm very grateful for what you have provided. I wonder if I'm able to share. Okay, so this project, well, firstly, should I say that the paper that I'm speaking to today is a substantial upgrade of the paper that was circulated before the conference. So my apologies for having not completed the paper to my satisfaction before that. This screen that you can see at the moment lists the members of the team who have been working on this matter at an international level as well as this particular national project. So you can see there that it's got people from a very diverse range of jurisdictions, myself from Australia, obviously, someone from Israel, someone from Czech Republic, someone who's designated there as a master's student. She's in fact from Germany, and 2 other Germans. So it's a project which commenced shortly after the pandemic first emerged, and the co-authors and myself found that it would be an important thing to do to document not just what was happening, but the way in which changes occurred, the sorts of changes which might have occurred as the pandemic continued. So this particular project then is a spin-off, if you like, from the larger national project, which involved almost 30 different parliaments from both presidential systems and parliamentary systems. So if I can turn then to the paper that I'm wanting to present, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to be a significant challenge for all political regimes, including parliaments. Democratic political systems are creative in initiating new policies and optimising the efficacy of implemented policies. Their systems features include pluralist democracy, vibrant civil societies, and functional parliaments. Now, of course, it's the responsibility of the executive to take action in a crisis, but it remains the responsibility of parliaments to oversee executive policy making, to deliberate on new ideas, and to ensure that politicians practice responsiveness and explain policy to the people. So we then move to, well, how have parliaments responded to the pandemic? What differences are there between national and subnational parliaments? And the subnational ones there, we'd be thinking of states, provinces, as in Canada, and territory parliaments, and there are some other minor terminologies which are sometimes used for subnational one. Thinking then about those questions, in the original research, the 5 of us who were the co-authors investigated the implications of the pandemic for national parliaments only. We selected the European Parliament and the remaining countries according to convenience. In other words, the availability of people whom we designated as country specialists who could collaborate in the collection of survey data. Now, that original research was extended to include the first, second and third waves of the pandemic in the parliaments of the Australian Federation, whereas up until that time, we'd confined ourselves to the first wave of the pandemic. The research framework that we looked at then was to investigate how the pandemic had affected parliamentary behaviour and structures in widely representative democracies. And if I can just scroll down. This is the framework that we have adopted, and you'll see there that there are 5 particular perspectives, and those perspectives then got translated into particular research questions. And those research questions were, firstly, what was the immediate organisational adjustment of Parliament? And Vaughn has given us a really good illustration of what happened here in Victoria. Secondly, how has the fulfilment of the Parliament's functions been affected? What has been the public perception of the Parliament's role in responding to the pandemic? Question 4 was somewhat similar to question 2, but not quite the same. Has Parliament performed its functions effectively? And particularly important, what shifts of power have emerged between Parliament and the Executive and within the Parliament? So in order to address those questions, we set up a questionnaire survey, a survey using questionnaires of the Australian parliaments, and we collected data relating to the first, the second and the third waves rather than just one continuous period. And we then asked people who, in the Australian case, were jurisdictional experts rather than country experts, if they could collect that information for the project for each of the 3 waves. And that led us then to look in a bit more detail at a few of the various matters which were covered in the survey. Now let me turn now to the next. This is just a reminder of the chambers that are affected here in Australia. So we, in fact, have a considerable diversity within Australia, but all of the Australian jurisdictions, of course, follow the Westminster model, and the variations are quite closely related to the Westminster model rather than any other. So I now turn to how the parliamentary functions were fulfilled. And the immediate organisational reaction and adjustment of parliaments highlights the key questions concerning the performance of parliamentary functions. And here we provide insights on core parliamentary functions. And for the purposes of this paper and the expertise of my international colleagues, the functions we have defined as parliamentary functions are electoral, legislative, oversight, communication, and representation. The electoral functions include things like appointing statutory officers, which exists in a number of acts of the Victorian Parliament, for example. So people like the Guardian and others are appointed by the Parliament rather than by the Executive or the Governor and Council. But the other important thing about the electoral process is that the members of the Parliament, of course, are elected. And during this period that we're studying, there was only one election to the Parliament, that was to the Western Australian Parliament. And as is general in Australia, those elections for the 2 houses in Western Australia were conducted concurrently. And it was then a very simple matter in Western Australia to appoint the executive to form a new government because the government had been elected with an overwhelming majority. But of course, we've seen other cases in recent history in Australia where the executive has been appointed after formally appointed after a vote on the floor of the Parliament, which has established who had a majority support. As to legislative functions, this could be a state of emergency or something equivalent. So, for example, South Australia has a declaration of a major emergency provision, and that, whatever terminology was used, was declared in most Australian states and territories, but only in the Western Australian case was the Parliament directly involved in authorising the state of emergency. And of course, governments are responsible for the administration of such legislation and of declarations and their implementation. But although the National Parliament lacked such a provision, except in relation to biosecurity, there was little consequence of the fact that the Commonwealth did not declare a state of emergency, as the functions were matters for state and territories in any event. And of course, as we know, there has been subsequent legislation at the Commonwealth level establishing powers to create a state of emergency. It's also important to note that the Victorian legislation whilst it did not require a parliamentary vote to authorise the state of emergency, the executive could only extend that declaration for a limited period, and had it not been replaced by fresh legislation in what would have been the fourth wave period, then the declaration would have lapsed entirely. As to sunset clauses, New South Wales and South Australia did not have a sunset clause for their state of emergency, but there were but the other four did do so, other four states and territories. Only one parliament was involved in invoking the state of emergency, as I think I may have said before. The overall picture in relation to special legislation is unclear. Vaughn has made the point that there was an omnibus legislation here in Victoria, but that was an unusual thing to occur. But if we turn to the specific portfolio area legislation which was passed, there was legislation on health which was passed in the three waves in Australia and South Australia, and in the first and second wave in Tasmania. Regarding the economic consequences of COVID, there was legislation passed in virtually every jurisdiction. And when it comes to other policy areas, there were not huge changes in the pattern of legislation making, despite the constraints of time which were imposed, as Vaughn has mentioned. Now, there's one of the things that we looked for was whether there, and this is the national legislation, one of the things we looked at was whether or not there was undue delay in the passage of legislation or whether it was rushed through. And what we found in the responses that we got was that there really wasn't very much difference. And what we could basically say about the legislation is that there wasn't much deviation from the average level of legislating. But of course, in that context, it's not surprising that in some cases, legislation directly related to the pandemic prevailed and dominated. On the matter of the oversight function, or what I've termed the accountability function, these seem to me to be the most significant of the areas that we've investigated. And what we've found is that effective parliamentary oversight to hold government to account requires quite effective and specific structures to be in place. That's because of the observation that majority parties will often block the creation or effectiveness of oversight committees. That is, if they've got majority control over the House or both houses. And what we find is that rigorous oversight is observed to develop where the government does not have a majority, and to fade away if government parties are in a majority. As to the committee structure, few parliaments changed their committee structure in response to the pandemic. And according to the information that we've got to date, only South Australia installed a special committee during the first wave. So the major change that occurred in Australia then, in fact, was at the federal level with the establishment of the Senate committee. And of course, as most of us are familiar, the Senate rarely has a government majority in it in Australia. It happens rarely, but not frequently. Now, I'm just keeping an eye on the clock here. There were a couple of issues which became clear from our reading of the data that we got back. And one concerns the tendency of national government to evade parliamentary scrutiny. And what we found was two different approaches. One was that parliamentary debates on the floor were more or less evaded by the government in 5 countries. to some extent in another 5 or so parliaments, to an even lesser degree in 4, and not at all in 9 parliaments. These are national parliaments. Whereas alternatively, the question time was more or less evaded by government in many parliaments, to some extent in 6, to a lesser extent in some, and not at all in several parliaments. Oral questions were more or less evaded by government in 5 parliaments, to some extent in 6, to a lesser extent in 4, and not at all in 8 parliaments. And not surprisingly, even written questions were more or less evaded by government in 5 countries. However, it's important to note that commonly parliamentary scrutiny is not formally evaded, but it is evaded in the sense that a government's answer may fail to provide the information that was sought and was necessary for effective scrutiny. And major differences in this style occur between parliaments, as I found in my PhD, which looked at 3 Australian jurisdictions. And finally, in relation to communication and representation functions, in answer to an open question that their parliament communicated during the pandemic as before, albeit with additional accents as to political challenges and possible solutions. The ratings are shown in the next slide, which I'll come to. So here we have an idea of the extent to which parliamentary communication was exacerbated or became less intensive. And here we find that for the most part, it either remained much the same as it had been before. And these are all the Australian jurisdictions, as you see. And in a couple of cases, they were really very strongly improved, and in a couple of cases, mildly improved. So again, we're finding some significant differences there between the state and the state parliaments in Australia. So in relation to communication at the national parliamentary level, in other words, in the foreign nations that we examined, leaders led increasing communication. That was represented both by the parliamentary leaders and by the individual MPs. And there was much less need for parliamentary party groups, in other words, the parliamentary political parties, to engage in more communication effort. Now, one of the important things that we looked at was the issue of trust. And again, here we have a table which indicates what was reported to us as having occurred in each of the Australian jurisdictions. So when it came to trust in the Parliament itself, it either remained unchanged or increased or decreased slightly, as did the trust in government. Trust in political institutions in general reflected that. The trust in the established media, as distinct from some of the other media that Margaret was talking about, remained pretty central, as did the trust in political parties. And one of the other things that I wanted to highlight is the importance of various actors who worked with the Parliament in one way or another, or at least had the opportunity to. And here we see the importance as reported to us, which indicated that there was a lot of support for the importance of to government importance of government in the first 2 of those cells there. But what's really significant is the apparent lack of respect for the input of economists in the form of economic expertise. So let me skip from that to my concluding comments, because I can see I've gone way over time. So our preliminary findings then was that there needs to be more research, and that's not an unusual finding. But while the survey of national parliaments find that significant changes occurred in many political systems over the first wave of the pandemic, the changes in Australian parliaments were mild and pragmatic and changed relatively little over the second and third wave. And there were relatively few differences reported to us between the Australian parliaments. But what was most important to us, we believe, was the matter of accountability. And the most significant aspect of the adaptation of parliaments to the pandemic is the effect on the accountability of the executive for the exercise of its extraordinary powers. And this occurred mostly at the state and territory level, the exercise of these powers, whereas the most visible accountability was with the Senate Select Committee on COVID-19. That committee was appointed to inquire into the Australian government's response to the COVID-19 epidemic. It received 557 submissions, conducted 56 public hearings, and many of those were reported in the media, and produced 3 interim reports before reporting in its final report just a few days ago on the 7th of April, after 2 years of investigation. The further work that we need to do is to collect some more data, including the sorts of issues that were identified by Vaughn in his paper. And we need to go back and do some much more detailed descriptions of individual cases in parliaments and how they develop, including the informal decisions and aspects of political decision making and coordination. We propose that there be a mixed methods approach to analyse the data and to apply methods such as quantitative comparative analysis to systematically analyse that data. Can I conclude by thanking Vaughn and the other contributors yet to be heard for the information which they will present, which will help us understand the way in which the pandemic has affected parliaments. So I'll conclude my comments at that point.
Okay.
Okay, Vaughn, we have a question from Anya D'Alessio. She says, Vaughn, thank you for the great presentation. Prior to the COVID experience, some interest was shown for remote participation. Now that we have done it, do you see it coming up again after the glow, getting back into the house wears off? Do you think that it is possible we will see a change to the understanding of being present? I'd just like to add to that. WA has pretty much an identical constitutional provision to Victoria about members being present for the purposes of quorum and for vote taking. And our Procedure and Privileges Committee actually, in a report on the pandemic, made a formal recommendation, which was basically that the Constitution Acts Amendment Act 1899 be amended to enable remote participation and remote voting. So didn't feel confident to do it without basically legislative change.
Yeah, so I guess remote participation is alive and well in our committees, and I guess that's one. So it hasn't really been thrown out with the bathwater. There's particularly in the standing committees that we have, there's been lots of remote participation, and there was legislative change introduced for the Joint Investigatory Committee so that they could do remote participation, which has only just been rolled over permanently now. Same, I guess, in terms of, first of all, most members, just about all the members I've interacted with on this are all just happy to be back in the house. So I think there's probably not a desire to go to remote participation anyway. But even if there was, I don't think same as what Isla's just said, I don't think there'd be much enthusiasm to do that unless various legislative changes had been made, because even though it's a pragmatic solution and probably a common and everyday understanding of present would cover it, there's a lot to lose if the High Court throws out all your legislation because you haven't had a proper set of quorums for it. So I think the stakes are too high for a government to, or even a parliament to just, hold their breath and hope. I don't know how much enthusiasm there would be to change it. There's probably some smaller changes that could be made in our Constitution Act that aren't some of the entrenched provisions, which make it a little bit easier. If you want to ask me about entrenched provisions, you can message me separately. Probably not everyone's interested.
If I can just hop in there, my understanding is that New South Wales also has a similar provision, and they took it to mean that they could not have remote participation.
And the federal parliament's in the same position.
Yeah, and I guess in terms of our standing orders and the committee's legislation, it's expressly saying that remote includes audio-visual. So, yeah, that perhaps suggests the more conservative interpretation of what present means.
Are there any other jurisdictions that have had formal recommendations through their procedure committees to amend the Constitution?
Colleen's got her hand up. And unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Now we can.
Right, thank you. I'm getting there, I'm learning. My question is for Vaughn, especially in the first part of your presentation when you were going through all the things that had happened, it struck me that quite considerable power had been given to the Speaker. And the Speaker was given discretions, if you like, that to the best of my knowledge under normal circumstances would not be granted. And I was just wondering, were there any alternatives to that, or was that the automatic go-to that in the decision-making process to try to go through what would have been a very complicated set of issues for you?
I guess, yes. I guess maybe a committee might have been formed. Cross-party committee could have been formed. I think probably the Speaker was the logical choice as in terms of being responsive to the House. And also, I should say the Speaker, when he is given that power, was very nervous about it, and so did consult quite widely and was quite conservative in how he approached things. I think because of that responsibility as well. Yes, perhaps a parliamentary committee. I think probably the idea was that you wouldn't want to delegate that function outside the House. You wouldn't want to give it to people who weren't members or even parliamentary officers necessarily. You wouldn't want to hang the Parliament sitting on how the Chief Health Officer felt about things, for example. So the provision was that the advice would be sought, but you weren't actually delegating the House's authority to any third party. And I guess in a sense the Speaker was, but he's there by grace of the House. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Just another point which sort of arises from that, and that is that in many of the European parliaments, instead of the Speaker having the sole discretionary power, there is a presidium which includes the Speaker, but people whom we might call deputy speakers, who are drawn from the other political parties represented in the chamber.
Okay. Good.
We've only got another few minutes. Are there any other questions? What we do actually, have we got?
There's another one in the box.
There we go. Monica Elliott. To add to the discussion of members present, New South Wales has just passed an amendment to the New South Wales Constitution allowing for remote participation under very specific circumstances. That's good to know.
I guess in the sense of accountability, it also is interesting that we had concurrent debates on some of those appropriation bills. So the Parliament one got debated at the same time as the general appropriation, whereas normally they'll be debated separately. I guess as someone interested in Parliament, for those two bills to be mashed together, is possibly, reduces scrutiny on the Parliament side of that appropriation, I guess, because everyone was to focus on the budget and on the major appropriation. And that actually continued through 2020 and for the mid-year budget, and then the make-up one that they did at the end of the year, they also had concurrent debates for the appropriations. And then last year for the 21-22 budget, they also had concurrent debates on the appropriations there. So, so hopefully that's not a theme that becomes entrenched. It's very convenient for the government of the day to combine those debates, but maybe not so great for transparency.
Well, we're down to our last couple of minutes. I'd like to thank you both for your presentations. It was quite a fascinating contrast between a very boots on the ground, practical, the effects of COVID, and a more sort of theoretical approach to how it affected accountability. Thank you both, and I hope that we will see them worked into papers for the Australasian Parliamentary Review. So I take it we now will leave this meeting to reconnect with the next one. Is that how it goes now, Vaughn?
Yes, I guess, I don't know.
So
I'll just let people push me out.
You guys will jump off and then our next session will come in.
Okay, fantastic.
So you guys just hop off and then our next presenters will come in.
Fantastic.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.